right, everyone, strap in. We've got a great episode today. Roller coaster market for AI companies this week. Dramatic times at OpenAI, and mega round for defense darling Anduril, and a lot of other topics. We'll start with the market, right? Crazy week. AMD posting record earnings. Intel, not so much.
Yeah, I mean, there's this long history, obviously, of AMD versus Intel, and we've touched on this in prior podcasts, with AMD often being the number two when it comes to Intel. Initially, in the CPU races for about 8 years, they were really far behind Intel before catching up, and they've been making strides. AMD has been making strides, good strides, in the GPU and AI markets in a way that Intel hasn't, and I think this is obviously the market waking up a little bit more to that.
So now that Intel has continued their march to less relevancy, AMD has swapped that role for perpetual number two to NVIDIA?
Or, I mean, you could make a bet that in some number of years, let's say a couple of years, they'll reach parity or parity minus 0.5 generations, something along those lines. Because they've been number two to NVIDIA now for, not to say 8 years behind Intel for CPUs equals 8 years behind NVIDIA for GPUs. But they've been, number two to NVIDIA for a while now in GPU land. And, they're hiring the right people, they're partnering with the right folks. And you could make a bet like that, which is, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, everyone, their chips are great, right? And NVIDIA handed them a little bit of a gift this week, announcing that there's a design flaw with their latest data center products, and they're basically going to delay shipments about 3 months, a full quarter, which sent, along with their strong earnings, sent AMD stock climbing like 20% on one day this week, and we'll see how it goes. I think the interesting thing about that is it came really late in the release cycle, where they were already shipping engineering samples before they discovered this design flaw. I don't know. I know they've moved to a more aggressive. They used to be on a biannual rhythm, and they've moved to an annual rhythm very recently, and maybe it's showing some signs from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this just goes to show that fabbing is impossibly hard, and NVIDIA, TSMC, these are companies well beyond most other companies out there in the world with the best people working on these products. Surely they have plenty of checking going on at every stage of the production process, and if NVIDIA can screw it up, you better bet the number twos and the number threes of the world are screwing it up even more.
Yeah, there's a lot made about using AI for semiconductor design. I'd be curious if they'll publish a postmortem on this design flaw.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really nice paper that came out of, and it's more on the academic side, out of Google. I'm blanking exactly on the dates for this, but Jeff Dean, I think, was the senior author on it, on using like reinforcement learning for chip design, like VLSI, things along those lines. These very hard combinatorial problems that have traditionally had a very huge human element to like rewiring components of a chip, things along those lines. And you also better bet that companies are putting a lot of money into the use of those techniques for these complicated chips. That doesn't mean that you can encode fab risk into the objective function or constraints of an optimization problem like that, but at the end of the day, you are still making a physical thing, and so you need to make sure that things that are making your physical thing are also good.
Yeah, good stuff. And on top of the AMD earnings, Palantir also reported very strong earnings, and another sort of proof point that the AI revolution is in fact catching on. And also, I guess we'll circle back on this later in the episode, but also a strong showing for defense tech and the importance of that when it comes to AI and national security.
Yeah, we'll definitely touch on that a little bit more when we talk about one of the big rounds that Anduril just raised. But yesterday, Palantir announced a strong partnership with Microsoft to sell into the government, and you're seeing some of these. I won't say AI first, because Palantir wasn't an AI first company. It's 20 plus years old at this point, but very like now AI native style companies partnering with legacy players that have strong relationships with the government. So I'm on a pretty bold case on that as well.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Well, let's shift gears and talk about some of the big privates right now, and what's all the drama at OpenAI? What's going on there?
Yeah, I do want to say, well, maybe we can come back to this with a prediction. I have a prediction on Intel as well, so let's leave that to the end.
Okay.
Yeah, so, OpenAI, nothing without its people, as they like to say, is always also nothing without its drama. And this week there's been quite a bit of announced drama. So one of their co-founders, John Schulman, who is, an incredible reinforcement learning researcher who went into AI safety, large language models, obviously, and so on, and co-founded OpenAI, is hopping over to Anthropic. So this is a little bit different than, retiring early or quitting to do a new thing. Anthropic is nipping at the heels at OpenAI, the direct competitor to OpenAI, and recently actually has been releasing models that are ahead of OpenAI's models for a bit before they catch up as well. So, you know, I don't know if that's a big loss or not a big loss for OpenAI, but it's a very interesting move for sure.
And just for a little historical context, Anthropic was started about 2 years ago when some OpenAI employees, early OpenAI employees, felt that OpenAI was losing a little bit of their moral grounding, and so they left to start their own competitor that was more focused on AI safety. And so, very interesting history between the two companies.
Yeah, Shulman's public about saying he wants to work, more focused on AI safety, and he at least makes the statement that this shouldn't reflect poorly on OpenAI's commitment to AI safety. But to Adam's point, this is just another example of folks, OG folks from OpenAI, making a shift to what the OG focus of OpenAI was, but no longer is. Yeah. We also have Greg Brockman, another co-founder, and a big face, obviously, of OpenAI, taking an extended hiatus. And, if you founded, I think OpenAI is about 9 years old at this point. The guy deserves a break for sure. But, you could view this as coded language, and also the fact that this came out at the same time as John Schulman's departure is certainly coincidental, to put it that way.
Very cool. And also some news, news on the product front. Start with the more tactical one. They launched structured output from their API keys, right? Which I think is interesting for a few reasons, but definitely moves things more towards the agentic future of interacting with structured outputs and inputs.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that there are libraries, by the way, really good libraries that have, I think the biggest one probably is something called Outlines that have been working to provide this functionality in an LLM agnostic way to folks who need this kind of output. And it's quite a lot of folks who need this kind of output, right? It's you're doing API calls, you're building tooling, you're doing code completion. These are areas where, unlike natural language, if you get a comma or a semicolon or a letter off, it doesn't work full stop, or it doesn't work in a way that you don't understand as well. And so a prediction that's pretty obvious is that all the other players are going to come out with similar functionality very soon. But this is good. I mean, this is hitting a pain point that a lot of people have, and a lot of people are solving in initially hacky ways, and then with these open source libraries like Outlines.
Yeah, so and just to kind of illustrate what this means, and John, correct me, keep me honest here, but an example might be, let's say I wanted to create a tool for creating emails, and an API-based tool. And what I wanted when I described to this tool with my input, when it composes the email, I'd want it to come back with separate fields for the subject line, the body of the email, maybe the recipients, things like that, and have them each in sort of like structured fields so that I could feed it into some sort of programmatic mechanism for sending an email, for example.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, this feels more like traditional programming, right? This feels like you have a contract with an API, and now you have output from a function that you can trust a little bit more than you could before, which, huge.
Yeah. Very interesting. And then I guess moving on from the sort of really nice kind of feature capability update to something a little more potentially paradigm shifting, right? There's rumors swirling right now.
Yeah. We mentioned this, in the last pod as well, about, AI traditionally having a reasoning component if you want to talk about true AGI, right? It's not just perception. It's not just learning. It's also reasoning. It's also acting. And OpenAI had some leaks a while ago on something they call Q-Star. I touched on some in the last pod about Q-Star being, thinly veiled, well-known white paper research in the reinforcement learning world. They've since renamed this product. This product is nominally encoding or hooking in some amount of reasoning into sort of a traditional large language model or multimodal model in their case. This is now nicknamed internally the Strawberry family of models, and there are pretty heavy rumors that this will launch very, very soon. And I'm on Twitter all the time, or X all the time, and OpenAI is doing their marketing very well with some sort of cheeky accounts on there. But there's a track record basically of following these accounts that leads to dates that are reasonably accurate on release. And so this could be a very exciting even week in AI.
Strawberry is such a friendlier name than Q-Star, right? Like Q-Star just sounds kind of sinister. I'm a little bit sad to see it changed.
I think it reminds me of, I'm going to date myself here, Star Trek: The Next Generation and Q. Well, I'm going to date myself there. Who wasn't necessarily an evil person, but also wasn't necessarily a good person, which maybe is where AI safety is taking these models anyway.
Yeah, or QAnon if you're a conspiracy theorist. I mean, there's like
Oh,
plenty of fertile ground to mine here.
So one last OpenAI comment, actually. They announced a new member of the board of directors, and so as we know, the OpenAI board of directors has also been engulfed in all of the relationship drama that with Sam Altman being ousted and then brought back in, and board members being taken off, and so on. But this is somebody I really deeply respect, named Zico Coulter, who is probably one of, if not the leading adversarial machine learning red teaming and just sort of like thinking about ways to do practical safety researcher from academia from Carnegie Mellon. And so I'm just excited to see him joining the board. He's a very sort of practical voice who's also extremely technically talented and respected by folks in the community. So this is a great hire on OpenAI's part. Cool. So we've talked about this a lot. I like to talk about it because it's really interesting to me, and it's a fast-moving space because the barrier to entry is so low. But coming up on wearables, right? These wearables that have some sort of AI enablement, either locally, so on edge, or calling out to the cloud. One of the OGs in this space for modern Gen AI first wearables is the Humane Pin. And they've raised over $200 million. They've actually shipped products. Sam Altman's one of their backers. This week it broke that, they have lifetime revenues of like $9 million. Let's not focus on that being a big number, but like let's look at the fraction of the number of Humane Pins that have been returned. So it's now something like well over $1 million of Humane Pins have been returned. There are something like 7,000 of them floating around in the wild still. And there's a lot of worry here, again, coupled with things we've talked about, like the Rabbit R1 and the Friend and some of these other sort of, what I'll call like weaker devices that have come out. There's a lot of worry about what this market looks like as it evolves.
Yeah, that's interesting. What kind of worry? Like a privacy or antitrust or all the above?
Yeah, privacy's one. I don't know about antitrust necessarily, but like, just like with wearables like Meta's Ray-Bans or earlier Google Glass, it might just freak people out, right? And so we'll see if there's a social norm or a backlash against this kind of thing. In the case of like the Humane Pins being returned, I don't think it's a privacy reason why they're returning. I think it's just people aren't getting value out of them. And so the question is, how do you get value out of them?
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. I think, a lot of times version 1.0, the technology's not quite there. And then maybe we'll see another one of these trends where 4 or 5 years from now, when everyone's given up on it, it'll actually start to work and catch people by surprise.
Harking back to some predictions I guess you had last week, Adam. Yeah, and I do want to say money's still flowing into the space, right? So Sam Altman was one of the backers of Humane Pen. He isn't exactly OpenAI, but he's clearly a big part of it. OpenAI is backing Opal. So Opal is actually a legacy, professional-ish webcam creation company, and OpenAI is putting money into them. You can bet to inject AI into those products as well. So the money's still definitely flowing into the space. It's just it's anyone's game at this point.
Yeah, that company definitely knows how to ride the waves, right? They came out with the premium webcam offering right as COVID hit, as I recall, where everyone all of a sudden was in video calls all the time, and now jumping in the wearables game. That's cool. Yeah. Their hardware is definitely, I've heard good things about it. I haven't experienced it firsthand. Awesome. And then other news in kind of startup world, private world, character AI follows the trend, a recent trend. So it was pseudo-acquired or partially pseudo-acquired by Google. And so their founder and about 30 of their machine learning engineers are leaving and going back to Google, where they'll really help steer Google's AI team. Curious what you think about that, John.
It's not my take, but it's a take that's all over the internet, is that venture capitalists for these companies like Character, like Perplexity, which had a similar situation, like Adept, which had a similar situation with Amazon, VCs are almost funding the basic R&D and product development arms of startups, of the FANG companies at this point, right? So if the expectation is you dump, in Character's case, I think 150 million, in Perplexity and Adept, even more than that, like 400, 500, 600 million, into VC-backed companies to get people to work really hard, and then that tech just goes right back to a Google or a Microsoft or an Amazon. I don't know. I don't know if the VCs are getting scooped here. I don't know who's getting a good deal here, other than the founders of Character, who went and founded a company and now have an even more sweetheart deal to do peer research back at the mothership.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think in some if not all those deals, the investors were either partially or wholly made whole. and at a minimum kind of got their money back. And actually, in all three cases, I believe the companies are still soldiering on, albeit with sort of maybe more focused scope. Maybe they're not, and a couple of them are no longer building their own foundation models. And I think one of the realizations of the last year is if you're going to be building your own foundation models, you need to be, there's only a handful of places that are going to have the resources to do it. So if that's what you're passionate about, like the founders of Character and Adept, some of them, then you need to be at one of these handful of places that is going to have billions of dollars at their disposal.
Yeah, it's a scary realization, and it's one I have. For those who don't know, I also wear an academic hat as a faculty member. It's one I have frequently with, especially PhD researchers, because it's fertile ground to do research in computer science and AI, ML still now, even if you don't have 5,000 H100s networked up correctly that you can have access to. But there is always this sort of like sinking feeling in academia whenever these like mega models come out, because they're really cool, and it really is, startups can't even do this, but like it really is a bit of a walled garden unless you hop into it. And yeah, this is a totally separate conversation. I am curious what this does to academic and to like small startup and to small traditional tech companies, small traditional company research moving forward, when arguably some of the really hot stuff is just, it has to be at the FANGs.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that kind of blurred line between academia and some of the big FANG companies is only going to make that line even blurrier, make that kind of a more fluid transition, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the guy Zico I mentioned who joined the board of directors, right? He's a faculty member at CMU first, but he's also at Bosch. He's also at OpenAI. He also is advising a startup in this space. I'm bullish on that. I like the fact that academia is doing that, but you have to know how to thread that needle.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It'll be interesting to see too how Character and Perplexity and Adept, they are continuing to build out the products that they were originally, founded around, just in a way where they're no longer kind of like building the core foundation models for the most part, and so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Whether you can build successful startups off of that, some degree of kind of scaffolding on top of a third-party foundation model.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are going to have to go back to a bit of scratch. And so in the event that the investors were made whole, maybe that clears their cap table in a reasonable way that allows them to not, act like a company that raised $500 million while they're starting, I won't say from scratch, but they're starting in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how it plays out, and it wouldn't surprise me if we see more of these types of situations in the next few months, just because of the way this is all played out, and just how much value is being accreted, and what a central role these large companies are playing. Similarly, kind of this is a good segue into something else I wanted to talk about, which is the world of antitrust. There's no secret that the current administration is attempting to put some degree of antitrust pressure on some of the large tech companies. And so significantly, Google was declared to have an illegal monopoly on search, I think largely because of the Apple deal for exclusivity there. And then in sort of less publicized but still kind of interesting news, NVIDIA has their acquisition of Run.ai there was an investigation that was opened up into that in the last week, which is kind of interesting because it's a nice piece for them, a nice acquisition, but as acquisitions go, not like the most massive or game-changing acquisition. And so I don't know, John, you interpret this as like a sign of the administration just getting more aggressive on this front?
Maybe, and again, we will likely have an administration change, minor or major, in the coming 6 months or so. So there's only so much that can be done. At least it's led by political appointees at these regulatory agencies. But yeah, when it looks at like Run.ai going to NVIDIA, so Run.ai roughly does GPU orchestration and optimization over GPU selection, and there is a concern that NVIDIA can become like the John Rockefeller basically of GPUs by, not just building the GPUs, but also building the software that you use for training, that you use for inference. And in this case, it would be building software that would allow you to potentially select hardware in an optimized way. And obviously if NVIDIA owns that, they would either walled garden that off to do just NVIDIA, or they would prioritize NVIDIA products over others. And so if you wanted to ensure that there is, consumer selection over more than just one product, this might be something to look into.
Yeah, really interesting. We'll continue to watch that. I know, going back to our earlier conversation about these pseudo acquisitions where they just hire away the founding team and pay out some of the investors. A big chunk of that's being driven by not wanting to have to go through antitrust scrutiny and have the deal, have a very non-zero chance of a deal being torpedoed after 6+ months of going through the process by antitrust regulators. And I think that's probably maybe the biggest driver for some of these situations being, kind of not being traditional acquisitions.
Yeah. Well, Adam, I mean, I just thought of a startup idea while you were talking, which is, some sort of agentic simulation to predict the probability of FTC action if you acquire or if you do a particular type of acquisition for a company in a particular space.
Sign off. Let's start whiteboarding it out.
Yeah, risk AI. Cool. Well, let's move into a different type of government land, and so this is defense tech and primarily U.S. government-based, DoD-based, and friends defense tech. Palmer Luckey's company, Anduril, I believe it's about 7 years old. Palmer, the primary founder of Oculus, which was acquired by, then it was Facebook, before famously being kicked out for, in part, political views, founded a company that is looking to compete with what are called the primes, the legacy primes. So these are folks who lead large contracts to create stuff for the government. So think about a Lockheed Martin, that's the big dog here, Northrop Grumman, what was SAIC, Booz Allen Hamilton, folks like that who can really sort of navigate the government process. Anduril and earlier Palantir are making like good cases for being able to compete in the same league as these primes. And so most recently, Anduril raised, I think it was $1.5 billion. It's something like a $14 billion valuation. This is, again, getting up there in terms of valuation. Now, the multiple they raised at, I was looking at public numbers. Their public numbers are at least $500 million in revenue. I'm guessing that's gone up. But this would be a 28 times multiple on like the annualized revenue there, which is higher than if you look at like a Lockheed Martin or if you look at like a Northrop Grumman. But it should be, right? Because these are different styles of tech companies than the legacy players. And so we're seeing this, both Adam and I talk to VCs constantly as well. Defense tech is no longer taboo to invest in part because of companies like this coming out. And so I think it'll be very, very interesting in the next couple of years to see other announcements in that space. I don't know what you're seeing there, Adam.
Yeah, I think so. I think the national security, there's been a lot of ramp up in our ability to successfully invest in AI. People don't realize when these huge budgets for AI get approved for the Defense Department and other government agencies, it's really hard to kind of ramp up your ability to effectively, kind of award and administer those contracts, and for the government to kind of receive the output of that work. And so I think that's a multi-year journey, and so these big funding increases that were announced with a lot of fanfare 3, 4, 5 years ago are just now, the government's just now kind of reaching the point where it can effectively work with the private sector to kind of adopt that kind of technology.
Yeah, and Anduril and also to some extent Palantir is more in the software space. Anduril is in the hardware space, which I would argue is harder. The timelines have to be a bit longer because you're building a physical thing, unless you're building the Friend wearable app, which I'm convinced is a Bluetooth speaker that talks to a foundation model on the internet. This is a hard process, but both of these companies take a different approach than the legacy players in that they will build out a solution and then search for money that will pay for that solution, as opposed to doing what is called traditional cost plus contracting, which basically says I'm going to do this at some floating cost, and I'll take a fixed percentage profit on top of that. It's like 7%. And the incentives are very different in these two worlds, right? If I, for example, in the former case, build a product and the government's like, this is crap, I won't pay for it, then I'm out a lot of money. Whereas if I get a cost plus contract, then I'm going to make that guaranteed small compared to tech margins profit on top of the money that's being spent. So, these are big bets that are being made. They're building out great teams for money behind it. So exciting times moving forward there.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. If you're ever curious more about that, you should read about some of the history of different kind of fighter jet development programs where in the recent decades, cost plus has been the most common, but there's certainly examples of the more proactive development, both historically and more recently, and the way those play out is so night and day difference. It's pretty amazing to read about.
Yeah. Folks who know me, I love to say that people respond to incentives. And so here firms, or well, I guess corporations are people. So here person Lockheed responds to incentives and person Anduril does as well. Cool. So touching on our last major topic, startup accelerators. So for those who don't know, these are things like Y Combinator is the most famous one. And these are intense, typically 3-month programs where you apply relatively early on with an early team and an idea, maybe a prototype, and seasoned founders, seasoned folks within the startup ecosystem help you quickly iterate toward product market fit over that 3-month period for a small investment at a relatively large equity hit, usually 6 to 7% of your company, for something like $500,000 to $1 million, depending on how you do these. All these startup accelerators do it differently. Y Combinator has a tremendous history of companies like Dropbox, Reddit, Airbnb, and so on. Another big player in that space, although they've been in a lot of trouble recently, is Techstars, and they announced recently in the past week that they're cutting another 17% of their staff. And this is coming after some recent shutterings of programs. So they would have local programs like Seattle's Techstars, which actually had some breakouts. I think like Data Robot was from Seattle. And some others. It's interesting to see like a very good, honestly, like they have success stories, a very good startup accelerator just running into issues.
Yeah, it is. I mean, they're fascinating. The whole incubator business model is fascinating because it's basically sort of VCs like to cultivate and think they're very clever and they can diligence a bunch of deals and figure out which ones the best ones are. But the incubators kind of take the opposite approach, right? Which is saying like, I don't care how smart you are, you're not going to be able to humans just do a bad job of predicting what's going to be successful or not. And so it's really just a numbers game and, we're just going to make small investments in a huge number of bets. And it's proven quite successful, like you said, in a number of cases. But I wonder right now, there's a lot going on in the startup world. There's the amount of asset allocation into venture capital, and in particular early stage, is like grown very quickly. And at the same time, the big tech companies have really kind of are so broad now and cover so many different parts of the market that it hasn't played out the way the startups tended to play out 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah. So, one big question there is, how many winners are we going to see in the incubator space? And I think the answer is more than zero in that Y Combinator is clearly successful. But, they're expanding. I think they just announced this week as Techstars was cutting staff that they're going to have a fall batch, right? So they traditionally used to be just in the summer. So, they would have like 3 months in the summer. They announced winter batches some number of years ago, and now they're going to have a third fall batch. And so they're increasing the number of these, to Adam's point, small bets in a large pool. And curious how that shakes out. My prediction might be just one.
Interesting. We'll see. So another example of kind of value aggregating to the big players in the incubator world.
Yeah.
All right, time to wrap this up with our favorite segment, predictions. John, what are your any big predictions this week?
I got two, actually. So the first, coming back to that AMD versus Intel argument, I think Intel has some serious problems that they need to fix. But I think the CEO at the helm of Intel understands those problems. It's a guy named Pat Gelsinger, and he's arguably who you would want to be the CEO of Intel. And again, as always, not investment advice, but he's somebody who grew up and cut his teeth on Intel. He understands the corporation, the corporate culture, the structure. I think he was lead of one of like the initial, the i4086 back in the 80s. Like he's the guy who led that. Like he's somebody who has all the components of what could be a CEO who leads one of America's honestly great tech companies into a turnaround. And if you look at the messaging that he put out along with the staff cut that they did recently, I think he's aware of that. And so the ball's in his court and his team's court at this point. But a prediction could be that it's not a 0% chance of Intel coming back. It's something reasonable.
Yeah, that would be awesome to see. I would love to, as someone who kind of cut his teeth in the computer science world when Intel was like the most aspirational company out there. I'd certainly love to see a strong and relevant Intel again.
Yeah.
Cool.
I have another prediction
Go for it.
coming into this. So yeah, so John Schulman, the co-founder, one of the co-founders of OpenAI, who went to Anthropic recently, he's an expert in reinforcement learning. So he came out of the academic world as well. Like he has a lot of published research in this space. Obviously, the publishing has slowed down since he co-founded OpenAI, but I'm excited for this because I think it's more than just an AI safety win for Anthropic. This is somebody who I think can really help Anthropic build out some of their reasoning and what I would call true agentic stuff in the Claude world. And so I think his move there is going to supercharge Anthropic as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Awesome. I've got I guess one more prediction. I kind of glanced by it earlier, but I think over the next few months we're going to see more of these kind of not an acquisitions where founding teams are hired away or chunks of companies are hired away. There's at least some effort made to take care of the investors. We'll see how much, and at some point there's going to have to be some sort of reckoning around are we really can antitrust regulators kind of intervene with that kind of stuff? Does it make sense, or can these large companies just continue to use it as an end run around any sort of regulatory scrutiny? It's going to be fascinating to watch that play out.
Yeah, be a good time to be a lawyer, I guess, at a big tech company. And going all the way back to 2000 or even earlier than 2000, the current president of Microsoft was the attorney who led Microsoft's combat against the FTC around the turn of the millennium. And did a great job, and now is number 2 arguably at Microsoft, and so there are going to be opportunities like that as well for the lawyers right now.
All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us this week on Ground Truth, and we'll see you next week.